Do you know how the lives of Jesus' apostles ended? They not only spread their message, but faced brutal deaths for their faith. Crucifixions, stonings, and martyrdoms that defy the imaginable. In this video, we explore how these men turned their sacrifice into the foundation of Christianity. Get ready for stories of courage and devotion that marked history forever. Simon Peter, known as Peter, was one of the closest and most influential apostles of Jesus Christ. He is widely recognized as the leader of the apostolic group and is often referred to as the rock upon which the church would be built, as Jesus told him. After Christ's resurrection, Peter took a prominent role in the spread of Christianity, leading the fledgling church and preaching to both Jews and Gentiles. Peter's death is shrouded in reports of martyrdom, with the narrative widely accepted that he was executed in Rome during the persecution of Christians promoted by Emperor Nero. This persecution began after the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD, when Nero blamed Christians for the disaster to divert responsibility from himself. According to tradition, Peter was arrested and sentenced to crucifixion. However, he, in a gesture of profound humility, asked his executioners to crucify him upside down. According to him, he was not worthy of dying in the same way as his master, Jesus Christ. This request was granted, resulting in an even more painful and prolonged method of execution. In the inverted position, the blood flow to the head accelerated suffering, and the body, in constant tension, took longer to succumb to asphyxiation or organic failure. The main factors in death and crucifixion. Peter knew that his death would be inevitable, as Jesus had predicted. In the Gospel of John 21:18-19, Jesus speaks to Peter. When you were younger, you girded yourself and walked wherever you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will gird you and carry you where you do not want to go. This warning was interpreted as a prophecy of his martyrdom. Despite this, Pedro remained faithful to his mission, preaching until the final moments of his life. The exact location of Peter's death is traditionally associated with Nero's circus in Rome. This area was a site of torture and public execution of Christians, used to entertain the Roman public. Today, the place where Peter is believed to be buried is marked by St. Peter's Basilica, one of the holiest sites in Christianity. Accounts of Peter's death were recorded by early church authors such as Origen, who stated that he was crucified upside down, and Eusebius of Caesarea, who reinforced this tradition in his historical writings. Despite the lack of direct archaeological evidence, the Christian faith has preserved this narrative as one of the greatest demonstrations of devotion and courage in the early church. Peter, until the moment of his death, served as an example of leadership, humility, and unwavering love for Christ. His story remains an inspiration to millions of believers around the world. Andrew's death. Andrew, brother of Simon Peter, was one of the first disciples to follow Jesus. He is remembered as the apostle who led others to Christ, including his brother Peter. After Jesus' ascension, Andrew dedicated his life to preaching the gospel in various regions, such as Asia Minor, Greece, and areas around the Black Sea. According to Christian tradition, Andrew was martyred in the city of Patras, Greece, around 60 AD. He would have been condemned to crucifixion by the Roman governor Aegea. However, his death did not follow the traditional crucifixion format. André was tied, not nailed, to an X-shaped cross, known today as the Cross of St. Andrew. This method was chosen to prolong suffering, a common practice in Roman executions designed to inspire fear. Even so, Andrew reportedly remained preaching while he was chained to the cross, encouraging those who passed by to repent and follow Jesus Christ. The choice of the X-shaped cross may have symbolized both the indignity of being crucified differently from Jesus and the attempt to humiliate the apostle. Even so, André accepted his fate with courage and unshakable faith. He reportedly endured 2 days of torture before dying, which allowed his message to be heard by many. Before his death, Andrew would have spoken words of praise to the cross, which he considered a sacred symbol because of Christ's death. According to tradition, he said, "I salute you, O cross, sanctified by the body of Christ." Before being used by my Lord, you were an instrument of dishonor. Now, adorned with his body, you are a source of glory. This demonstration of faith and acceptance of death reinforced the devotion of many Christians in subsequent generations. Tradition states that Andrew was buried in Patras, but his remains were later taken to Constantinople and later to St. Andrew's Cathedral in Scotland, where the X cross became the country's symbol. Death of James, son of Zebedee, James the Greater. James, son of Zebedee, also called James the Greater, was one of the first apostles called by Jesus and was part of the most intimate circle of disciples, along with Peter and John, his brother. He witnessed significant events such as the transfiguration of Jesus and his agony in the Garden of Gethsemane. James was one of the closest apostles to Christ during his ministry. James' death is narrated in the book of Acts of the Apostles, 12:1-2, which reports that he was executed by order of King Herod Agrippa I, around 44 AD. About that time, King Herod began to persecute some of the church. He had James, John's brother, put to death with the sword. The method of execution, beheading, was a common practice for crimes considered serious by the Roman government, such as treason or insurrection. In the case of James, his preaching and influence on the growth of Christianity were seen as a threat to the political and religious order. James' martyrdom occurred in Jerusalem during a period of intense persecution against Christians. Herod Agrippa I, a Jewish king aligned with the Roman Empire, sought to please both the Romans and Jewish religious leaders by suppressing the Christian movement. James' death was an attempt to destabilize Christ's followers and discourage other church leaders. One Christian tradition mentions that the soldier tasked with escorting James to execution was so impressed by his courage and faith that he converted to Christianity on the spot. According to legend, this soldier was martyred along with James, expressing his new faith until the last moment. After his death, devotion to James grew significantly. Centuries later, his supposed relics were transported to Santiago de Compostela, Spain, which became one of the main sites of Christian pilgrimage, known as the Camino de Santiago. Death of John, son of Zebedee. John, brother of James and son of Zebedee, is widely recognized as the author of the Gospel of John, the three epistles that bear his name, and the book of Revelation. He was one of Jesus' closest apostles, often called the beloved disciple. Unlike the other apostles, John did not suffer violent martyrdom. His death was of natural causes, but not without persecution. After Jesus' ascension, John dedicated his life to preaching the gospel and leading the early church. He experienced intense persecution for his faith. According to Christian traditions, John was arrested and taken to Rome, where he faced attempted execution. One of the most notable was his supposed immersion in a cauldron of boiling oil. Miraculously, he emerged from this torment unharmed, which led many to believe that God had protected him to fulfill his mission. After this event, John was exiled to the island of Patmos in the Aegean Sea by order of the Roman Emperor Domitian as punishment for his preaching. During exile, he wrote the Apocalypse, a text that reflects his views on the end times and the triumph of Christ. After Domitian's death, John was released and returned to the city of Ephesus, where he continued to lead the Christian community. He died at an advanced age, probably around 90 years old, becoming the only apostle to die of natural causes. Although John was not martyred, his life of suffering and dedication inspired countless generations of Christians. He is often represented as the apostle of faith, love, and hope. Its central message about God's love, especially in passages like, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son." John 3 verse 16 resonates to this day. Philip's death. Philip, one of the 12 apostles, was called by Jesus at the beginning of his ministry. He is frequently mentioned in the Gospel of John, standing out for his inquisitive spirit and for leading others to Christ. After Jesus' ascension, Philip dedicated his life to preaching the gospel, traveling to regions such as Phrygia in modern-day Turkey and other parts of the Near East. According to Christian tradition, Philip was martyred in the city of Hierapolis in Phrygia. His preaching and the miracles he performed deeply angered local authorities and pagan religious leaders, especially because he challenged the worship of local gods. One popular version of the story claims that Philip converted the wife of a prominent city leader, which triggered his arrest. He was sentenced to crucifixion, but in a particularly cruel way. He was said to have been tied to a cross upside down, similar to Peter, and hung by his legs. This position not only caused physical suffering, but was also used to humiliate the condemned. While on the cross, Philip continued to preach and pray, which impressed many of those who witnessed his execution. Some traditions report that, before dying, he asked forgiveness for those who martyred him, echoing the words of Jesus on the cross. The city of Hierapolis was known for its religious fervor and pagan cult practices. Philip's Christian message, which rejected idolatry, directly confronted local customs, making him a target of persecution. Philip died around 80 AD, and his courage and faith until the last moment inspired the local Christian community. His tomb became a place of pilgrimage in Hierapolis, and recent archaeological remains in the region confirm the existence of a church built in his honor. Death of Bartholomew. Bartholomew, also known as Nathanael in some biblical passages, was one of the 12 apostles chosen by Jesus. He is mentioned in the Gospel of John as a man in whom there is no falsehood, John 1 verse 47, characterized by his sincerity and faith. After the ascension of Jesus, Bartholomew dedicated himself to preaching the gospel, traveling to different regions, including Armenia, India, Arabia, and Ethiopia, as reported by Christian traditions. Bartholomew's death is considered one of the most brutal among the apostles. He was martyred in the city of Albanopolis, Armenia, today Derbent, Russia, or its equivalent in historical traditions. Bartholomew reportedly converted the local king and many of his subjects to Christianity, which infuriated the pagan priests. As a result, he was captured and sentenced to death by torture. According to tradition, Bartholomew was skinned alive. This horrific method involved removing skin from the body while it was still alive, causing extreme pain. After this torture, he was beheaded to complete his execution. Bartholomew faced his death with courage, maintaining his faith until the end. The brutality of his martyrdom symbolizes his total devotion to the mission of Christ and his willingness to sacrifice everything for the spread of the gospel. His story has inspired generations of persecuted Christians, especially in Armenia, where he is revered as one of the apostles who brought Christianity to the region. Bartholomew is often depicted in sacred art with a knife, symbolizing the instrument of his torture, or holding his own flayed skin, as seen in Michelangelo's famous Sistine Chapel painting. He is venerated as the patron saint of leather workers and healers. Death of Thomas. Thomas, also known as Didymus, meaning twin, is remembered for his curious and inquisitive personality. He became famous for the episode in which he expressed doubts about the resurrection of Jesus until he touched Christ's wounds, which earned him the nickname Thomas the Unbeliever. However, after this event, Thomas demonstrated deep faith and played a significant role in the spread of Christianity. Thomas would have traveled to distant regions, preaching the gospel in Mesopotamia, Parthia, and especially in India. Christian tradition believes that he arrived on the southwest coast of India, in the Kerala region, around 52 AD, founding Christian communities that persist to this day, known as the St. Thomas Christians. Thomas was martyred in the city of Meliapur, near Madras, present-day Chennai, India. According to tradition, he aroused the ire of local religious leaders by converting many people to Christianity, including members of the nobility. Accounts vary, but the most common is that he was stabbed with spears while praying in a cave. The scene of Thomas's martyrdom is often described with him kneeling, in deep prayer, before being attacked by soldiers or religious leaders who did not accept his preaching against idols and local customs. Even in the face of death, he remained faithful to his mission and spiritual convictions. Thomas is venerated as the apostle who brought Christianity to India, where his communities still maintain a rich cultural and spiritual heritage today. The Basilica of St. Thomas in Chennai is one of the sites traditionally associated with his tomb and is considered an important pilgrimage destination. The story of Thomas shows how even doubt can be transformed into unshakable faith when guided by personal experience with Christ. Death of Matthew. Matthew, also called Levi, was a tax collector before becoming a disciple of Jesus. His conversion is seen as a symbol of Christ's universal calling, as tax collectors were despised by many in Jewish society at the time. Matthew is traditionally considered the author of the first gospel, which highlights Jesus' role as the Messiah promised in the Old Testament. After the ascension of Jesus, Matthew dedicated himself to preaching the gospel. He is said to have traveled to various regions, including Persia, Ethiopia, and other parts of Africa and Asia. His missionary journeys were marked by his dedication to reaching the marginalized and converting people to Christianity. Matthew's death is reported in different ways in Christian traditions. One of the most widespread versions states that he was martyred in Ethiopia. There, Matthew is said to have challenged pagan practices by converting a member of the royal family to Christianity, which infuriated local leaders. According to tradition, Matthew was stabbed to death while celebrating Mass or preaching the gospel. He was attacked by soldiers sent by a pagan ruler who felt threatened by the impact of his preaching. Matthew is remembered as an apostle who embraced humility and redemption, transforming his life as a tax collector into a mission dedicated to God. He is venerated as the patron saint of accountants, bankers, and tax collectors, and his gospel remains one of the main sources on the life and teachings of Jesus. Death of James, son of Alphaeus, James Lesser. James, son of Alphaeus, also called James the Less, is one of the least mentioned apostles in the New Testament. He is often identified as James the Less to distinguish him from James, son of Zebedee, and James, brother of Jesus. Although little highlighted in the scriptures, tradition reveres him as an important leader in the early church. Little is known about the missionary activities of James, son of Alphaeus, after the ascension of Jesus. Some traditions suggest that he preached in various parts of the Middle East, including Persia, present-day Iran. He was dedicated to spreading the gospel in challenging regions, facing resistance from religious and cultural leaders. The death of James is described in various ways in Christian traditions. One of the most common accounts states that he was martyred in Persia by stoning, a common execution practice among Jews and some Persian communities at the time. Another tradition mentions that James was crucified during his mission. According to this version, he was captured by authorities hostile to Christianity and sentenced to death for refusing to renounce his faith. Despite the violence he faced, he maintained his conviction until the end. James, son of Alphaeus, is remembered as an example of fidelity and perseverance. Although his life and death are less documented, his dedication to the gospel and his willingness to sacrifice everything for his faith make him an admired figure in early Christianity. Death of Thaddeus, Judas, son of James. Thaddeus, also called Judas, son of James, to differentiate him from Judas Iscariot, is one of the least mentioned apostles in the Gospels. He is known for his question to Jesus during the Last Supper: "Lord, why will you reveal yourself to us and not to the world?" John 14, verse 22. Christian tradition describes him as a zealous missionary who took the message of Christ to challenging regions. After the ascension of Jesus, Thaddeus would have preached the gospel in several regions, including Syria, Armenia, and Mesopotamia. According to tradition, he worked together with Simon the Zealot and was instrumental in converting many to Christianity in territories dominated by pagan religions. Thaddeus' death is reported in different ways in Christian traditions. A common version states that he was martyred in Persia, present-day Iran, along with Simon the Zealot. Both were reportedly killed by axe after provoking the wrath of local religious leaders for their mass conversions. Another tradition mentions that he was killed by arrows while still preaching the Christian faith, refusing to deny his belief. This form of execution reflects the antagonism faced by the apostles in regions where Christianity was seen as a threat to traditional religions. Thaddeus is venerated as the patron saint of desperate causes and lost cases for his unwavering dedication to carrying the message of Jesus, even in impossible circumstances. He is often depicted in Christian art holding an image of Jesus, in reference to the tradition that he took the portrait of Christ to King Abgar of Edessa to cure him of an illness. Death of Simon the Zealot. Simon the Zealot, also known as Simon the Canaanite, is mentioned in the Gospels as one of Jesus' 12 apostles. His title, Zealot, may indicate his earlier association with the Zealot movement, a Jewish group that advocated Israel's independence and resisted Roman rule. After his conversion, Simon abandoned any political ideals to become a dedicated follower of Christ. After the ascension of Jesus, Simon would have preached the gospel in several regions, including the Middle East, Egypt, and Persia, present-day Iran. He often worked alongside Thaddeus, and both played an important role in the evangelization of these areas. Simon's message was particularly challenging in contexts where local religious practices were directly opposed to Christianity. According to Christian tradition, Simon was martyred in Persia. He is believed to have been sawed in half, an extremely cruel method of execution. This would have occurred because he and Thaddeus converted a large number of people to Christianity, including members of the local nobility, which provoked the fury of the pagan priests. Another tradition suggests that Simon was crucified or hacked to death, but the account of being sawn in half is the most widely accepted, symbolizing the extreme sacrifice he made for his faith. Simon the Zealot is remembered for his passion and devotion to the cause of Christ. His life reflects a radical transformation, from a fervent nationalist to a peaceful messenger of the gospel. He is revered as an example of perseverance, even in the face of the most intense persecution. Death of Judas Iscariot. Judas Iscariot is widely known as the apostle who betrayed Jesus, turning him over to the religious authorities for 30 pieces of silver. His betrayal was a pivotal event in the events leading to Christ's arrest, trial, and crucifixion. Despite his choice to betray Jesus, Judas is still counted among the 12 apostles due to the role he played in the New Testament narrative. Judas betrayed Jesus by identifying him with a kiss in the Garden of Gethsemane, facilitating his arrest by the high priest's guards. He later regretted his betrayal and attempted to return the silver coins to the authorities, but his remorse was not enough to reverse the course of events. Accounts of Judas' death vary among Christian scriptures and traditions. Hanging. According to the Gospel of Matthew 27:3-5, Judas, filled with remorse, threw the coins into the temple and hanged himself. This account describes his death as an act of despair and guilt for having betrayed an innocent man. Mortal remains. In Acts of the Apostles 1:18, Peter mentions that Judas acquired a field with the money from betrayal, and there he fell headlong, his body breaking and his bowels spilling out. This version can be understood as a consequence of his hanging, where the body would have fallen after the rope broke, or something similar. Although these accounts seem contradictory, some scholars suggest that they may be complementary, describing different aspects or perspectives of the same event. Judas Iscariot is remembered as the example of ultimate betrayal, but also as a symbol of human free will. Their role in the divine plan continues to be the subject of theological debate, with some interpretations emphasizing their individual responsibility and others highlighting their inevitable function in the salvation narrative. Death of Matthias. Matthias was the apostle chosen to replace Judas Iscariot after his betrayal and death. His election is described in the Acts of the Apostles 1:15-26, where the other apostles, led by Peter, sought to maintain the number of 12, representing the 12 tribes of Israel. Matthias was selected by lot between two candidates, after prayer asking for divine guidance. After being chosen, Matthias dedicated himself to preaching the gospel. According to Christian tradition, he would have traveled through several regions, including Judea, Ethiopia, and possibly even the Georgia region in the Caucasus. His mission was to reach people who had not yet heard about Christ, bringing the message of salvation even in the face of persecution. Like many other apostles, Matthias suffered violent martyrdom. Accounts of his death vary, but the most common traditions include stoning. Some traditions hold that Matthias was stoned to death by Jews in Judea for his preaching, a common practice for those considered blasphemers or heretics. Decapitation. Other sources suggest that after stoning, he was beheaded, a final gesture to ensure his death. This method reflects the hostility he faced when challenging established beliefs and practices. Despite being mentioned briefly in the New Testament, Matthias is remembered as an apostle who completed the mission of the 12. Your willingness to face death for the gospel demonstrates your commitment to Christ and your unshakable faith. He is venerated as a saint in both the Western and Orthodox churches, and his liturgical feast is celebrated on May 14th, Catholic Church, or August 9th, Orthodox churches. And now that you've learned about the incredible stories of courage and sacrifice of the apostles, how about sharing this legacy with more people? Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell so you don't miss our next videos full of biblical history.